Excited to be joined today by Jeff Stein, who is a reporter for the Washington Post and great friend of the show, but more importantly for today, host of a new podcast called American Carnage that is on radical abolitionist John Brown, and which is fantastic. I really recommend it to people. Great to have you, Jeff.
Thank you guys so much for having me on. It's exciting to join independent media.
Oh, yeah, yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Welcome.
Congratulations. Welcome to the show.
Before I ask the first question, let's just get a taste of what this podcast is all about. We have a bit of the trailer that you released. Let's take a listen.
John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering to be a soldier in the army of the Lord. He's gonna be a soldier in the army of the Lord. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
Explain to people what fascinates you about him and what were some of the questions you were trying to answer in this podcast series.
Do you guys recognize that movie?
No.
No, I didn't actually.
It's from like a terrible, atrocious, impossible to watch Reagan movie from the 40s.
Oh,
it's
really?
All about glorifying the post-slavery side in the war.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, God.
Yes.
And
what's
yet,
it called?
I'll send you it later.
Okay. I'll look it up later. Yeah.
And yet, despite the attempt to make John Brown look crazy in that film, he looks awesome. He looks really interesting and really cool and really fascinating. And I think the reason we got into this and the reason I got into this was because I don't think that political science is a thing.
I kind of agree with you, but why?
People think of political science as almost like taking an approach like chemistry or physics to how political change happens, how political processes unfold.
Yes.
And the reality is that, sounds like you might agree, that from my perspective at least, historical events involve so many variables and so many inputs, and it is impossible to try to get it down to the beaker and the lab equipment that you could in a chem lab, right? And so the historians want to look at what happened in the past and try to draw links rather than try to say, what are the elements that create a historical moment or create a moment? And with that in mind, I think the reason John Brown is so interesting is because he forces us to reckon with what is actually what causes change in this country. And I actually think you guys understand this intuitively at a real level, where we have this conception, right, this idea that is very much in like the official Washington world where I operate, where people are presented every 4 years like a list of ideas, and then their agency consists of going to the ballot box and being like, I like this or I like that. Like you would look at a restaurant, it's like, oh, here's the menu. But what that elides, right, is like, what is going on the menu? How do we decide like what the political process is giving people the choice between? And when you look at John Brown's story, it's this question of how did this issue that when John Brown was first emerging on the scene was not even really a germ in people's heads. I mean, abolitionism, much less, the racial egalitarianism that John Brown believed in, was so unbelievably fringe.
3% of the population.
More fringe than the people you guys have on here.
You're right.
People like yourself.
Yeah.
People like me, And so what is the process, the historical process by which someone tries to move that, to shift that? And that's what I found so riveting and so captivating. How do you... W.B. Du Bois, his biography of Brown, it's interesting because some of the historians today, I think, are much more accurate than like the historians from 50, 60, 100 years ago, as Du Bois is.
Yes.
But they don't write in a way that touches the soul, the way that someone like Du Bois or James Baldwin can. And what Du Bois says is that, what Brown reveals is that historical processes really shift by people who are able to activate the part of our consciences that are not explicable parts of the political process. So things that we understand intuitively are immoral or wrong, somewhere deep in our core, it takes someone in the public, maybe media, maybe an activist, maybe a radical abolitionist who starts invading federal armories. It takes someone to activate our latent sense of morality and justice. And that the idea that political change is instead driven by people at the top giving options that then people vote on is missing how important that activation process is.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because Brown was you could see there's many ways, right? There's like the great man theories, there's a structuralist theory, there's like many others. I basically subscribe to all three, which is why I also don't believe in political science. But if you're to go and you're going to look at it, we could see like why Brown, right? Because Nat Turner's rebellion is what, 20 years before?
Yeah,
Gets crushed completely, right? And actually the Northern public is like, oh my God, this is horrifying. Why is it that Brown himself, like right when it happened, it was like the perfect moment to awaken, exactly like you said, and to also draw the right contrasts, right? So like for Brown, and there's everybody, it's so crazy when you look at his story. It's like Robert E. Lee is involved in the John Brown, you know, question. You're like, oh my God, like what a precursor. And then
John Wilkes Booth is out.
Exactly, you got John Wilkes Booth. It's like, how is this all like, it's like a story. It's like a movie, and yet it was real life. So what did you find when you were teasing that out as to why his spoke to people at that moment when, like I said, Turner and all these other folks, it didn't work out.
And give people a little TLDR if we have some non-John Brown buffs in the audience.
So on October 16th, 1859, John Brown and about 20 men will invade a federal armory at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. The idea of this raid is that Brown is going to, I mean, as you said, it is cinematic in its
literally,
scope, which is why it makes such a good story for a podcast.
Right.
Brown and his little guerrilla army, he wanted more men, but he just decided that the place that they were training was at risk of being exposed. So he and about 20 men will invade this federal armory at Harpers Ferry, and they will go around the nearby plantations, liberating slaves, including the slaves owned by the great-grandnephew of George Washington. They take these two amazing heirlooms, a pistol that the Marquis de Lafayette had given George Washington, and a sword that Frederick the Great had given George Washington. And they take those and they free George Washington's descendant slaves. And then they come back to Harpers Ferry, and they've taken this town. And that is when this moment that I've been really focused on recently is like, why doesn't John Brown leave? Because the whole conception of this raid is that they're going to take these freed slaves, they're going to ride off into the Appalachian Mountains, and from there they will launch little raids on southern plantations, free more slaves, and eventually build this massive black colony that will destabilize the slave system, which is ambitious certainly, but not super crazy, I don't think.
It has some
logic to it. It has an internal, I mean, I wouldn't.
It has more logic than staying in the armory, getting your sons killed, and then getting on trial.
Yeah,
but
what are you doing, John? Get out. But what really happens, you know, when Brown stays, then the militias of Harpers Ferry, the white militias, come, and then the federal government sends the U.S. Marines, as you were saying, under Robert E. Lee, later the leader of the Confederacy, to crush John Brown. And what happens in the immediate aftermath is kind of similar to what you see after Nat Turner, where people are outraged and they want this guy killed, and even the Northern abolitionists who were his allies say, oh, maybe there's legal jeopardy here, I want nothing to do with this. And so you have this massive immediate reaction that this guy is bad. And then partly because he's white, right, unlike Nat Turner,
yes,
but also partly because he's able to articulate himself in a way Nat Turner never is. John Brown, in the aftermath of the raid, is going to be put on trial, which again, Nat Turner does not have this luxury of having a public audience where he can articulate and sound clear and level-headed and appeal, and then he becomes this martyr, right? Because he's facing his death. He's just watched his sons be brutally maimed and die in his arms, and the tragedy of the story, and the fact that, I think we can get into this, I have so much to say about John Brown, as you can tell, but he really was not that violent at Harpers Ferry. We can debate his actions in Kansas, which are more morally ambivalent, I think. But in Harpers Ferry, I think part of the reason that he gets trapped there is because he is concerned for the well-being of his white hostages, and he treats them well, and this becomes part of the historical record after the fact. A handful of people do die at Harpers Ferry, but he's really in a defensive crouch. I mean, his attitude is like, let me liberate as many slaves and escape, and they're not going around. I mean, I think a lot of people have this misapprehension of Brown as this, you know, crazy white boy who went around just slaughtering slaveholders. It's much more, he was not intending on killing a lot of plantation owners in the South. And so that, combined with the fact that Virginia, you know, while Brown still is like suffering from wounds to his head, he has this massive kidney injury. There's a scene where he's in court because the slaveholders are so insane that they insist on speeding up this trial, even though he is unable to stand up. So they wheel this cot into the courtroom, and he has to pull the blanket over his face. So his stoicism in that moment, and on the gallows, where even the Confederates will recognize that he was incredibly brave in the face of death. That sort of like sense of valor, that sort of machismo, helps turn his image. And I think that is a big part of the reason that the nation was ready to receive his message in a way that they weren't for not
Yeah,
turning.
I absolutely think you're right.
And then what do you see as the reverberating impacts of that? I mean, almost what you're describing is like through what came to be seen as his valor, selflessness, his willing to die, his willing to sacrifice his own kids on behalf of a cause that he saw as being so righteous, that it really caused people to sort of awaken in them their own sense of injustice and change the opinion. So how does that reverberate throughout history? How does that help create the conditions that, lead to the Civil War?
It's a great question. I mean, John Brown there's this fascinating, self-fulfilling dynamic that begins to happen in the South, where the South is really determined after, even though John Brown is so exceptional as an abolitionist, he and his 20 guys are so unlike all the other abolitionists who, William Lloyd Garrison is the other most prominent abolitionist at this point, and he is an adamant pacifist, and he looks down on what John Brown is doing and thinks it's all rubbish. And so John Brown is really exceptional, but because the South wants to make John Brown out to be the prototypical abolitionist and Northerner, they begin accusing everyone else in the North of being an abolitionist, like John Brown. And so there's this weird effect that begins to happen where, because the South starts saying these insane things about all the Northern abolitionists, equating them to John Brown, eventually the Northern abolitionists are like, well, maybe we do believe in him, because their response is so disproportionate and so insane.
Yeah, I think it's actually, so just to pick up on that, really what happened is that the fire eaters, which are the people who wanted to get out of the Union and to have secession, they saw it as a validation of their worst fears. And they're like, well, if they're going to do it to us anyways, we may as well arm up and we may as well secede.
Yeah.
And then people were, well, hold on a second, you can't actually secede here. And it's like, and if you're not going to take all this federal property and all that with you. And really, it increased, I think, militarism in the South, which in turn, like you said, showed the North. They were like, okay, we genuinely have no other option but resort to arms.
The paranoia became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because when the South was insistent on seeing everyone in the North as John Brown, they started doing things in response to that that actually turned people in the North into militants, right? Because the South started arming themselves.
Literally. Yeah.
And I got into a Twitter argument with someone who was like, it was super rational for the South to secede. I mean, maybe because at that point when Lincoln won in 1860, you see the end of the expansion of slavery.
Yes.
And so maybe the political balance of power is going to shift in a way that is, spells the death knell of the South, and therefore they should take their shot and try to get England on their side of the war. And maybe that's their best gamble. But to me, you look at the stated intention of Lincoln, and this is why, I'm curious what you guys think about this, because to me, the answer to the question, who freed the slaves, right? I mean, you have the Lincoln Monument up there behind you. It's it's Lincoln. That's what people say. Lincoln was not talking about freeing the slaves until events forced his hands. Do you know who really wanted to free the slaves? It was John Brown. And the idea—
Wait, so are
And Frederick
you
Douglass.
telling me Nikki Haley lied to me and the Civil War was actually about slavery? Is that what you're saying?
Anytime Nikki Haley wants to come on American Carnage would be
She's invited.
honestly glad to have
on
her
the
discuss
podcast.
John Brown.
Jeff, how do you grapple with this moral question that you present at the beginning of your podcast of basically how do you think about someone who some people would define as a domestic terrorist, John Brown, especially like you said for the actions that helped spark this Bleeding Kansas period, which was incredibly, bloody and violent. How do you grapple with someone who is violent, but on behalf of a clearly just cause?
I think it's a difficult question. I mean, we get into all the competing historical debates in the podcast. Just very quickly, do I have time to explain what happened in Kansas?
Yeah.
So the fate of the expansion of slavery will fall to Kansas. I know this is kind of boring, but in 1854, Congress says they passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which gives the rights of the people in the territory to decide via election whether that territory enters the Union as a free or slave state. And that's really important because it will determine the balance of power within Congress. And at this point, the pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri interfere with the elections. They steal the elections. They completely pollute democracy, and they start going around killing the anti-slavery side. And so that's kind of the stakes of what happens when John Brown is fed up by all this, and he gets a credible threat that some pro-slavery guys from Missouri might go around and annihilate, is the term they use, him and his sons. And at that point, Brown decides to stop this pacifistic campaign, to finally take retribution. He and his men will execute 5 men in the middle of the night with these swords, gashing their body and cutting them. It's all grisly and bloody. And if there's any Dan Carlin hardcore history fans out here, I promise you'll not be disappointed in our podcast. But the question becomes, right, like, was the killing of 5 people who were not slaveholders, not plantation owners, not even particularly crucial to the pro-slavery side in Kansas, was that a justified killing? And I would say the majority of historians that I read for this project say that they're not. But the ones that do say he was justified will really point out that, you know what was also terrorism, you know what was also violence, was slavery.
Yeah.
And we talk about Brown's killings as this form of like terroristic violence. And these historians who are more sympathetic to Brown will argue, and I think quite understandably, that we never talk about the slaveholders or the founding fathers who kept people violently against their will as a form of terrorism. But how is it not, right? Like, it's and so
That's a great point.
if you consider slavery to be a form of warfare, which seems legitimate, at least in theory to me, then why is Brown responding to that terrorism by killing these guys, not a form of like engaging the battlefield? That's the counterpoint.
It also belies the fact that there was massive violence on the pro-slavery side too, to kick all these abolitionist voters out.
Kansas.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, massive. I mean, absolute bloodshed. So I can sit here and talk about this all day. We're running out of time. So Jeff, where can people find the podcast? What should they do? Rate, subscribe. What do you
American Carnage on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Patreon. If you want to throw $3 our way, we'd be super grateful as well, but no pressure.
We'll put a link down in the description.
It's really interesting. It's obviously very relevant to the current moment in terms of the violence in Gaza and, discussions about Hamas and a lot of the same sort of like moral and ethical questions. I'm not going to like say it's equivalent, but there are some echoes here.
Who writes a few years ago that John Brown is the 19th century Hamas and Hezbollah equivalent.
Wow. Oof, that's
and
too hot.
I will leave it to, you have to listen to the podcast.
He's going to try to keep his Washington Post job as well and not fully comment on that particular dynamic.
Don't step in that. That's our job.
But Jeff, it really is fascinating. I'm learning a lot from listening to it, and it's causing me to think a lot too, like I said, about current moral quandaries. So thank you so much. It's great to see you. Congratulations.
Great to see you, man.
True pleasure to be on. Thanks, guys.
Good job.
Yeah. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.